The information economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. Inside Analysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com. InsideAnalysis.com. And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
Oh, yes, folks. Welcome to the future. Indeed, your host, Eric Kavanagh, here on the only coast-to-coast radio show in the U.S. of A. that's all about the information economy, Inside Analysis. And folks, I'm very excited today to have a very special guest, an industry visionary, someone who has been working in this space for a number of years and has always seemed to have his finger on the pulse of where things are and where things are going. And that's especially difficult to do in these days with this new remarkable power of generative AI. We'll be talking to Andrew Turner. He is the general manager of a company called Praxi Data. They're doing some very interesting things in that space. And before we dive in, I wanted to throw out a bit of my past here as I think about a metaphor to describe what we're seeing in the world and what this GenAI stuff is really doing. And I'm reminded of the philosopher about whom I wrote my thesis in college in philosophy, Jacques Derrida. He wrote this very dense piece called Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. And it was deep. And he starts off with this whole concept. He says, let us assume that something has happened, like an event, if that word weren't so loaded. And he refers to it as a sort of rupture or redoubling. And what he's kind of talking about is a movement to another level of self-awareness, almost like cultural self-awareness, and how that cultural self-awareness is now shaping and sort of reshaping how we interact with each other, how cultures are shaped around the world and change. And if you think about this generative AI stuff, it's really what these guys have created, what these folks have created, is a reflection of the text of our world. That's really what it boils down to. These engines like OpenAI and Bard and Llama 2 and all these huge foundational models, as they're called, they have been trained on the corpus of text on the internet. Maybe it's Wikipedia or any number. Twitter, for example, is a very good source of information, X as it's now called. And they are now reflecting back to us this corpus of text, of language, of communication. And Andrew will talk a bit about the transformer models and some other things that were enabling Jürgen Schmidhuber, who I've interacted with, very smart guy. He wrote papers on these transformer models, and they do really interesting things. So in the earlier days of these large language models, you could only see like a token or two to the left or right. In other words, backwards or forwards. You could think of a token as like half a word, basically. And what these engines are doing is just predicting text that the engine thinks you want to see based upon your prompt. Well, there's this whole issue around embeddings you have to use, which are like memories to a human, basically. But your embeddings combined with the generative power of these models, this predictive capability is what has created these things. And the transformers allowed the engine to have multiple agents, if you will. So now you can see a number of tokens forward, a number of tokens back, and get a much clearer picture. Just think of it as extending your view as you're driving down the highway. Before, it's like you were driving in dense fog. Now the fog is gone and you can see pretty far forward as you're driving along. So it helps to create more accurate depictions of what the prompt is telling the engine to create. But it still is an engine just predicting text, basically. But the other nice thing about these transformers is that they allow for there to be multiple agents. I refer to it as almost like a peanut. Participants who are suggesting what the next word should be. And then at a certain point in time, the engine goes, okay, I'm going to go with this word next. I'm going to go with that word next, et cetera. Well, that's what they're doing. But we're just at the beginning of this. I mean, interactive AI, I think, is going to come next, and that's going to be even more interesting. But let's just stay focused on the Gen AI. And what do we mean by dark data? So the title of today's episode includes dark data. That's all the data you have that you don't really know about, that you haven't cataloged, that's sitting on servers somewhere or sitting in a file system somewhere. And that's probably more than 80% of the data that any mid-sized or large organization has. So you better be very careful about pointing this AI gun at a vast trove of dark data, because you don't know what's coming back. And this stuff is so complex now that it's difficult to figure out exactly how the engine got the answer that it got. And this is partly why you have hallucinations. As a friend of mine, Eugene Burke, says, these large language models don't have an epistemological boundary, meaning they don't know what they don't know. And that could be a very dangerous thing, because that's when they start making stuff up. Like ChatGPT told me I wrote 3 books. I was like, did I? Are you seeing in the future or something? Because I don't recall writing any books, but maybe. But anyway, someone who has focused on this for a while now and is working with a company that is trying to harness and, if you will, tame this dark data, shine a light on this dark data, is Andrew Turner of Praxi Data. Andrew, welcome to Inside Analysis. Tell us a bit about what you're working on today and how you're helping companies make the most of this technology while mitigating the risks.
Well, firstly, thank you for letting me join you from a very cold London tonight. So we're in a slightly different time zone to where you are. I think as we all know, all these technologies go through a certain cycle, and we're now in this kind of I wasn't going to say hype, but we're in this kind of roller coaster ride of recovering from OpenAI's movement of releasing ChatGPT. Just about 12 months ago, really now, isn't it? So now I suppose what I would say is the kind of the dawning of actually, okay, let's stop talking about all the things we could do with it. Let's talk about something we can do with it.
Right.
So I think this is where the pragmatism kicks in, and the marketing's got to stop, and the actual delivery of value is going to happen. So
that whole thing.
Not to say that the marketing won't stop, but I think it was a really good intro. Thanks for doing that intro. I think the interesting thing that we find is that people are still struggling with what to do with this stuff. So they've been working on data related programs for multiple years, and then this kind of tsunami of generative AI happens. I was talking to the chief data officer of a very famous media company in London, and the positive thing was that she said that actually the CEO literally contacted her when this whole ChatGPT thing hit the business, and said, what do we do from a policy point of view? Do we use it? Do we embrace it? Do we actually put a kind of moratorium on it so nobody can use it? So I think the positive she saw to that is actually the CEO contacted her to say, how do we govern this type of technology? Let's not shut it down. Let's work out how we can actually coexist with it. So, but it's probably happening in lots of boardrooms at the moment is, what do you do with it? What is the business use case? How do you prove the value, and make sure that you can get something out of it quite quickly to build? It's the classic thing about scoping something that's of a reasonable scale, not too big, so you don't create this Bermuda Triangle where you disappear into Bermuda Triangle and you never get out. But how do you find scope something that's actually of value, and actually go and deliver something, and then you can scale it from there. So it's back to those kind of principles. I think whether you're embracing generative AI or other things, but one of the things that we're doing at Praxi Data is trying to look at how do we hit this conundrum of managing data at scale. And to the point you did in the intro is this whole issue of there's lots of data just sat around and being moved around your organization and being, stored. Yeah. But do you actually have your arms around it? So, shining a light and putting a real proper enterprise level discovery across that data set, whether that's, unstructured data, semi-structured, or structured data, which is traditionally where people have looked at just purely structured data. Obviously, when you get into large language models, you're looking at unstructured and semi-structured. So how do you get that kind of overview on that data, and then actually identify where are your risks and opportunities? And actually, one of the things we've done recently, and this could become more important, is build effectively business use cases and industry models to help these organizations really accelerate. Because there's lots of tools out there, but a lot of them are very generic. So
right.
You're in a property and casualty insurer. They don't want to have a generic tool. They want to look at metadata and particular data models that actually they can relate to from a business point of view to make decisions. That's the work that we've been doing at Praxi Data to be different, because I was speaking to Mike Ferguson, who you probably know, at Big Data London a few weeks ago. He said there's something like 38 different data discovery, data data catalog types of solution out there. So if I'm a buyer, if I go back into where I used to work at Tesco or GE or whatever, it's a buyer's nightmare. How do you decide what you're going to buy? So what we do is we do something very, very narrow, but very, very deep. So that's what we're focused on, is how do we add value, but not try and say we can do everything, but effectively do automation, do curation as a service. So, we're looking at how do we use our industry models, our domain expertise, and give that value add into the actual overall analytics value chain. That's what we're focused on.
And you know what? You just gave me a good opportunity to bring Ted Lasso into the conversation, which of course is taking America by storm on Netflix, or maybe it's Apple TV. I don't even know which streaming service it's on. I think it's actually Apple. But the joke there is, you take this, I think it's like a college football coach or something, and they bring him over to England to coach a actual football, we call it soccer team, which is an outrageous proposition, because it's like, what the heck does this guy know about soccer? Or, Premier League football, which is a serious deal. It's a very, very different game. And the point being here, you typically want someone with domain expertise, because you don't want to hire a medical doctor to fix your car, for example. I mean, maybe he or she knows how to fix cars just serendipitously, but that's certainly not their core area of expertise. And if you're talking about trying to wrangle with these models that have, some of them 1.9, 3.2 billion vertices or something, this is incredibly complex stuff. You can't boil the ocean. It's an age-old mantra in the IT world: don't boil the ocean. That's kind of what folks are starting to do, but you're not taking that direction. You're saying, no, hold on. Let's focus on these specific ontologies for certain industries and businesses, right? Because that way you can pull this off. Because if you try to use, and this was my concern very early in the game when I was listening to people talk about this, I'm like, okay, I get where you're going with this, but my goodness, the training will take forever and a day. And by the time you're done training it, like, are you even in business anymore? I mean, it's like, you can get value, but geez, you got to be focused, right?
Well, yeah, the issue as well is that, I was talking to a bank in the Nordic region the other day, and the issue still is around where, because the technology takes so long to deliver, and then what you've got to do is work out a sustainability model, to actually, you've got to win the hearts and minds of the people who are going to manage the data going forward.
Right.
If it takes, multiple years to get to that point where they can actually start adopting it, then, the hard stuff is the soft stuff, actually the change management, to actually engage, reward, incentivize, train, educate the people who actually have got that deep domain expertise. When they see something that's actually they can relate to very, very quickly, you're going to improve that engagement. You're going to improve that. You're going to make change management a lot easier as well, because you're talking their language.
Right.
If you've got a generic tool and you start with a blank canvas, then you've got a lot of work to do before you get to even to that you could say base camp, from an Everest or climbing a mountain kind of analogy.
Right.
And that's a frustrating. If you're the leader of that business unit or that particular function, you've got a lot on your hands to sort out. So we saw this a few years ago when we were working with Andrew Arn and myself was the CEO and founder. We were working in another company, and we were doing some Herculean pieces of work in very large enterprises, but it just taking too long to get to that base camp. So we said, how can we accelerate that? Put the effort into building the models. So you can obviously get free open source models from Hugging Face. There's a lot there's been some really great work they've done, but we believe that there's some real added value in those industry use cases and industry models, and that's what we've been focused on as our kind of USP.
Well, and so the ontologies or the industry models that you start with, they're really like roadmaps. They're like a legend, if you will, for this discovery process. So at least you have hallways to go down, rooms to look into, instead of trying to, find something in the entirety of the United States, which is just too big to digest, right? And that's the challenge. If you're trying to digest too much, you just get overloaded, and the system, the brain just crashes, and you just move on to something else. You just can't do it. So you provided pathways essentially of discovery, and then you use the technology to look around and to curate. And I have this new concept I keep talking about. I need to write something and stick a pin in it, so to speak. But I kind of view these foundational models as a second chance for data. And what I mean by that is we spent all these years organizing, analyzing, doing data warehousing, and then data lake architectures and all this stuff. But it was all sort of the same concept that you persist data somewhere and then you go around and you try to analyze it and number crunch it and so forth. And, we have a mess out there. I mean, if you think of the corpus of information that any mid-sized to large organization has, it's monstrous. It's all over the map. It's in all sorts of formats, and there's really no way you're going to tame that. But with these foundational models, it's like we got a second chance to sit down and carefully curate what we want to put into our embeddings, into our memories, if you will, for the AI to learn. And if you do that right, that I think is going to be really compelling. What do you think? We got 2 minutes before the break.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, that phrase we use, messy, murky, dark data. How do you grab your arms around it? How do you make it a real impact on that? And one of the things we've architected our solution is do it at cloud scale, because that's no longer a constraint. So we're going to be making it available on the cloud provider marketplaces. So you can basically try before you buy. You can grab your arms around this stuff. You can apply it into your own data set. Get the momentum, get people on board, and then scale it from there. Because that thing no infrastructure is no longer a constraint anymore. Right. You can get on with that. You can select it from the marketplace. Do it by tomorrow. It's provisioning that type of infrastructure is like an overnight thing. It takes you a couple of hours. It's not something you have to work weeks and months for. And have an army of people to do that. You can do that from the established players. So that's also what we're going to be releasing as well, to make it accessible and make it adoptable, and actually then you're going to win people over, and then people are going to adopt it.
Well, right, because you think about the patience of the average person these days, and there's no doubt that change is always difficult. Change is always hard. Some people are better at it than other people, but everyone has to deal with change. And probably the older you get, the less willing you are to change. It's kind of your old habits die hard, as they say. But to your point, if someone can make progress in a fairly short period of time, or at least see where they're going, that's the key. That's the way you kind of win the hearts and minds. And, it sort of reminds me of my own writing process. When I have to write something new, at first I'm like, oh goodness, what am I going to do? I have to find a starting point. I have to find, where is that base camp? Okay, the base camp is up there. And once I find that, I can climb my way to it and then take a few deep breaths and then prepare for the next part of the journey. And that's kind of where we are right now. I think everyone's trying to find their base camp, but folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, take us to the future indeed. I love that song. That's by Black Bananas is the band. You got to love it. I love that song. And it reminds me of William Gibson, the futurist. I've always wanted to meet a futurist, be like, are you even here right now, man? But anyway, he's a smart guy. And he said, the future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. It's like, oh, that's a good one. And of course, it also means the past is still here, just in pockets all around us. So it's an interesting dynamic. But we're talking today with Andrew Turner, General Manager of Praxi Data. That's Praxi Data, just like it sounds. And we're talking about GenAI and making sense of dark data. And we wanted to talk about the different roles, things like prompt engineering, for example, which is a real task. Now it's a real skill set. And as many people have said, and I think this is true, it's not so much that AI is going to take jobs away per se, as it is that people who learn to use AI effectively are going to have a much better time getting jobs and doing their jobs than people who don't. It's like any other tool. You don't see too many yaks out there in the fields tilling the land. We're using giant machines to do that stuff these days because they're much more efficient. And I've always believed that machines can do the job better than people. Let the machines do the job and let the people do the more interesting things on top of what the machines do. But Andrew, we are going to have to deal with some pretty heavy duty change management, right? In our deep dive earlier, you talked about this McKinsey quote where they said that they now believe we'll be able to automate many of these processes 10 years sooner than we had previously thought. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's a step change. You're like skipping a decade basically, and it's going to require us all to get our sea legs, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely. I mean, that quote came out on the 4th of October, so it's only a few weeks ago, and it's absolutely, when you think about the ramifications of it, it's absolutely staggering. You talk about, I remember the days of business process re-engineering, but that's like, to your point, it's like business process BPR on steroids,
Right.
times 10. So, it's kind of like it's saying, it's a real opportunity to redesign and really step change and reorganize the organization. And any CEO that's listening to this session that kind of says, oh, we can put it on the back burner, we can ignore the impact of generative AI, it's literally, that'd be a mistake.
Yeah.
But the question I think is then about, how do you then sit down with your people team? What is the organization of the future? Because I think it is that point you made a bit earlier. It's not just replacement; it's coexistence. And actually, how do you shift the work into that new type of role? And then it is a piece around upskilling, and how do you upskill the right roles in the future? And one of the things that I was sat in the audience at this recent session where there's a couple of CTOs presenting their take on, from a technical perspective about their view on generative AI. And they said, it's pretty much the whole organization structure is going to be impacted at different levels. And people that we traditionally call, developers, the rock stars of the future, or, the rock stars of the today and the rock stars of the future. But then, I think it's going to change that role because people are spending a lot more money on people in this kind of area. And actually, how do you get the productivity out of those? Everybody wants to be a data scientist, and then you pay market rate to attract the best. But then actually, how do you put the tools around them to actually become productive and impactful in that organization? So, generative AI puts that next layer of complexity on that. I think there's an opportunity for organizations to help other enterprises to actually educate them on prompt engineering. I think it's a core competency going to be going forward. And if you've not done prompt engineering or interacted with Bard, ChatGPT, etc., then it is like talking and interacting with a real person. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. And I had Matt McClarty, the CTO of Boomi, on the show a few weeks ago, and he had this great line where he referred to what era we're in a certain sense. And we talked about machine learning and AI and what's really happening now. And he said it's a time of learning, meaning we humans are now learning what this stuff can do and how it works. And we're learning about how to make it hum. We're learning about what the challenges are. And it kind of reminds me of something. I worked with a couple of Russians years ago, and there was the good Russian and the bad Russian. The good Russian was Nikolai Menchukov. He was a very smart guy, Nikolai Menchukov. He ran the first ever advertising agency in Moscow, because when Perestroika came out, all of a sudden you had a need for ad agencies. There was no need before in the communist system, because why would you have an ad agency, right? So he was the first to do that. He's a designer, but a very good coder too. And he built out this whole system. But he would say funny things to me. Like one day he said, the funny thing about the web is that no one knows how it works. All we know is it works. Right. And that's kind of where we are with this LLM stuff. I mean, we do know more about how it works. You can get into the weeds, and the embeddings are crucial, right? Because the models have been trained on this corpus of text that is vast. It's very, very large. So there's good stuff, there's bad stuff, there's truthful stuff, there's not truthful stuff. And so it has all this material, but the AI engine itself is kind of like a teenager with a tremendous vocabulary.
Correct.
But it still doesn't know the sort of mores and the rules and what it should do versus what it shouldn't do. And these are all important things to know. And so to me, those embeddings are crucial. And I get back to this sort of second chance for data concept, because once your organization understands what these things are, and you kind of wrap your head around some of the use cases like customer support, for sure, that's a big one. news gathering, news dissemination, news generation, I think, is going to be revolutionized by this stuff. Once you wrap your head around it, then you can sort of start the process of figuring out, well, what do we want? How do we want to teach our teenage child? Do we want to send it to Catholic school? Do we want to send it to public school? Do we want to homeschool, basically? And you really have to know like what your appetite is. And that gets into the training side, right? So you don't want to be trying to boil the ocean. Don't try to, do 2 full-time jobs and educate your 5 kids by yourself. You're probably going to burn yourself out if you do that. So you have to kind of understand the scope and the appetite and where you're going. And if you do that, and you use tools, I think like Praxi data, for example, I think you're going to have a really good chance of success. But what do you think, Andrew?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what you were touching on there was that what I would call data toxicity. So that thing about, because of, there was a scenario that we looked at the other week where if you get it wrong, the way you connect these things together, you can actually generate data, and then it actually publishes that data, and then it feasts on itself. So it becomes like a carnivore for its own data set. So the danger there is that you go back to origin. What's the origin? What's the syndicated origin? And what's true and what's not true? Yeah.
Right.
So
right.
There's a piece around that, lineage. Yeah. And the kind of the inheritance of that data, which becomes back to some kind of fundamental how you manage data at scale principles. Yes. You need to get right. So, back to the point you said a bit earlier about this, what we see is this messy, murky data. You've got all this kind of patchwork quilt. People have gone out and bought lots of tools, and they've evolved over time. But actually what we see is being this kind of like, I suppose, this, I think we talked about this, this backplane, like a backplane concept. How do you have a backplane across your enterprise that you can actually rely on, that you look after properly? That's going to take in these different types of data sources. So you have that. I don't want to. It's an age-old phrase, but that golden record, golden definition, right? And people are still struggling with that. So all we're trying to do is not say you're going to throw away all the investments you've already made, but how do you actually tap into this model, these models, this industry insight to add value to your getting those people on board, and then dealing with the change management we talked about a bit earlier, because that is really, really the sustainability model. That's the biggest issue we can see out there. People can keep buying these tools, but until you actually work out a path to get people engaged, that's the key to it. So we can't, I don't know. Will we have situations in the future where we have robots managing the data in our organizations? There's that tacit knowledge that's up in here in the brain, right? That people have got experience about, that is difficult to codify. I'm sure we'll work out through brain-computer interface a way of codifying at some point in the future. But for the next few years, I think that's where we're trying to add some value in this kind of this ocean of data that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think for use cases, certainly chatbots are going to get a lot better. A lot of times in enterprise technology, stuff comes out a bit too soon, right? When the chatbots first came out, I think they weren't quite ready for prime time. And so they didn't do as well as we needed them to do. And as well as I do that people have a very short attention span these days and very little patience. So when something doesn't work out, like, oh, that didn't work. And then these impressions last, right? These impressions linger for periods of time, and it's hard to sort of shake off that old mindset and realize, no, this is a new tool. This is a new way of doing things. But I think that the key is to help people understand that used properly, this new suite of technologies is going to make your job a heck of a lot easier, and it's going to make your job more interesting and more fun, is I guess a way I'd put it, because in general, machine learning algorithms are very good at tackling very tedious tasks, like scanning 50,000 purchase orders and finding the 27 that have some error in them. Well, a human being go record after record after record, forget about it, man. It's a nightmare, and it's terrible for morale. So as long as people understand, and this is my beef with the media writ large, is that I have this expression I throw out there that the narrative is always wrong, because the narrative is a story, and the story is not reality. The narrative is some story I've spun up around components of reality, but the reality with AI is that it is making our jobs easier or making certain jobs easier. It's not necessarily taking jobs away, and it's not the red-eyed robot that's going to take over the world and all that stuff. But the media loves to focus on that. They love to focus on negative because that sells, it gets eyeballs and so forth. And I think it's important that people recognize this as a whole new tool set. You know, I mentioned Derrida, this sort of redoubling. It's a reflection on everything that we've seen already. So now it's almost more like riding the wave instead of trying to create the waves. We have the waves now. Now we have to figure out how to ride them. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you were touching on a bit earlier about that the chatbot situation was that, you know, you obviously the data that feeds the chatbot, right? So you're touching on this thing about there's been some scary situations happen recently with, you know, what do you do privately and what do you do publicly? Yeah. So, you know, how do you deal with that? The risk around data privacy, preserving privacy around that, you know, building your own private, you know, LLM models, your own data models. So putting your domain expertise with recognize other external data sources. And that's where you're going to have that differentiator in service, because if you create that kind of that data source that then is an input into your chatbot, you're then going to stand a much better chance of having a delighter as a customer experience that's going to drive loyalty. Yeah. So, you know, one of the use cases we've been looking at recently is with an organization that's dealing with insurance and roadside recovery and that kind of thing, where you kind of combining lots of, you know, are you getting complaint letters into a call center? How is the call center agent dealing with and linking and saying, who is that particular customer that's affected by that? So you're getting different types of data input, but you've got to connect these dots. And how do you put an infrastructure in place to allow you to do that? You've got to then, you know, you've got to work, it's a complex object, it's a complex structure of how it's sat in a CRM system or something like that. But then actually you've got a different type of interaction of data coming in through letters and call center records. How do you make sure you connect those dots to make the right decision to look after that customer,
right,
or deal with that service intervention? So those are the types of thing where we can see that having this kind of foundational capability is very important, where you're actually connecting the different types of data that before were siloed. Yeah,
that's a really good point. Yeah, that's very interesting, because you're right. When you think about the old way of connecting systems, and I'm old enough to remember EAI, Enterprise Application Integration, right, where we would connect one application to another. Well, in the old days, you would look at things like primary keys and foreign keys and stuff like this as a very it's declarative, and what's the other one? I can't even remember the name. Different kinds of programming. It's very specific instruction. Go here, do this. Go here, do that. But it's rigid. It's a very rigid connection. And what you want is more of a fluid connection that can accept inputs from multiple sources, like you say, from the call center, from text messages, from mobile, from your laptops or whatever. There are all these different sources which to manually connect. Yeah, you can do it, but it's kludgy, and it's also not very performant. And then you wind up spending all this time and effort trying to figure out how to optimize the performance. Oh, let's add some hardware over here. Let's add some caching over there. These are very, specific tactile things that you can do, tactical, but it's hard to pull off. Whereas with these foundational models, that's what they do for a living. That's what they were designed to do, is to take sources of information and fuse them and then generate some output. And if you can train that to do something using only your trusted data, the second chance for data that we're talking about, then you're really going to get somewhere, because those things can do it really, really, really fast. And they just kind of figure stuff out about how to do that dynamically, instead of having to give such specific instructions to your systems people about how to get this connected to that and that connected to this. They're kind of solving that out of the box. But folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, welcome back to our show today, the Dark Data Challenge, solving the Dark Data Challenge with practical GenAI. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, talking to Andrew Turner of Praxi Data. Praxi, practical. I don't know if that was the logic behind it, but and now let's talk a little bit about public versus private, right? So when you're on Google, when you're using ChatGPT, let's say the original one, that's the public version that's trained on all this data that's out there, but it hallucinates, it does all kinds of different things. What you really want is a private instance that you then very carefully train by curating only the data that you want, only the trusted data. It's like teaching your kid how to grow up. You want to be careful about what you expose them to, not too much YouTube, not too much TikTok. Maybe we screwed up on that one a little bit with our kid, but anyway, we try our best. But tell us about your thoughts. I think every company is going to want to have their own private instance of one of these models and just over time build it out and let it support things like customer support, let it support things like even supply chain, other stuff. But what are your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think people originally thought there was only one model. So
Right.
they only thought there was only a public one. And you probably heard about, there's been various examples where, the high-tech company based in South Korea, uploaded their source code into ChatGPT, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think that, this is where the CISO comes in. So this is where the kind of, the IT security compliance piece and the chief data officer around, data privacy is you've got to govern your assets as you would govern, any other asset. So you've got to, it's just a different type of asset that you're having to manage here. So yeah, there's a raging debate, but the net is you've got to build your own private, generative AI asset library, your set of models,
Right.
to address that problem, because we know there's some class actions going on, there's some litigation going on with certain tech companies at the moment around the things that they've done prior to coming out to market, and it's obviously causing a lot of concern for a lot of organizations. So I think getting the right advice around how you architecture what you're going to be putting in place, but you've got to have something that's protected. It's kind of like sleep at night factor that you've got to think about, and you've got to get the right people around the table. And I think that the key thing I think is also, if you're a CEO or a CFO, is looking at the leadership team you've got working for you to give you briefings so you understand the ramifications of just putting this this thing together in the right way. I think then you can really exploit it. So that's the kind of that's the thing that we're seeing. There's people are definitely speeding up now. They've been watching and waiting. They've been dealing with this massive tsunami and all the kind of as you mentioned, the kind of media and PR around this. But people now wanting to get into brass tacks, get into real use cases, work out how they can actually make some real big impact in their organization, reshaping their organizations. We talked about a bit earlier with their organization structures. And then, I think it's raising the importance of that chief data officer role, the chief digital officer, the CIO, the CTO, to be at the top table again, and actually to really help the CEO and CFO and top team to make those really, really strategic decisions.
Yeah, when you think about digital transformation, which we've been talking about for 20 years or so, and we've been doing digital transformation, but this is almost like wholesale organizational transformation is what can happen if you do this stuff right. What do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think, I was literally 2 hours away from presenting something, and that McKinsey quote came out. I mean, it's absolutely mind blowing.
Right.
Taking 10 years off an organization's evolution within one stroke. So, obviously, is that a precursor for, please bring up a very large strategic consulting firm to actually, help you with that transformation. But you need some help. I think you need to get the right people around the table, and you need external help. There is and that's what's driving up the cost of resources, because there is a finite resource of people who know what the path should be. So that's the key thing now, is actually how do you get the right team on board? How do you accelerate with this stuff? Don't wait. You've got to get your arms around it. So
yeah, at least the planning side of things, right? You've got to get the C-suite and key directors on board to recognize that this is a direction for almost everyone for the future. I mean, to not use this stuff is a bit crazy. I think you're just going to get steamrolled if you don't. It's like the dot-com age. When the dot-com came out and everyone realized, oh, wow, so now I can sell everything online. I don't have to have all these brick and mortar stores. Like, well, that was a pretty big change in terms of how we view the internet. And now you have this new, incredibly powerful set of technologies. And to your point, you can use different models. There's the ChatGPT, there's Bard, GitHub has Copilot, Microsoft, they all have their own version, if you will. So but you have to start somewhere. So at least start the planning process, get people to sit down and understand what's possible. And the best way to do that on an individual basis is just to play with this stuff, right? Just get in there and start playing it, giving it prompts, see what it gives back to you.
Create your lab, create your your data lab. It's reinforcing that type of innovation lab. What we're quite impressed with actually what Meta are doing with Llama 2. We've been pretty impressed with that as a foundational capability, because they've been through some quite interesting PR over the last few years about data privacy and preserving that kind of dimension. But we think they've done a really good job around the stuff they've been doing around llamas. So I think that's something to think about as you put that reference architecture in place and you get these right people in room and you get on with a sprint. Get some value done in a few weeks, get that into the board, and show what's possible with this stuff. And that's the way you're going to transform your industry, rather than being transformed or put in a difficult position where your competitors are actually doing something. We were looking, as we were looking at recently, was you can use these types of tools to do competitive analysis on identifying what are the strengths and weaknesses of yourselves and competitors that's been indexed by these types of model.
That's right.
If you're not leveraging that kind of stuff, you're missing out.
Well, and I heard, and I haven't verified this, but I've heard it from a couple sources now, and it makes complete sense, that Google has been quietly building a vectorization layer underneath G Drive and Gmail, such that in your prompt of Barb, you can do @Gmail, @Drive, and it will then point to your vectorized information and use that to generate its answer. And that is pretty darn cool. I mean, to already have it there. And just to explain to folks what these vectors are, what these embeddings mean, an embedding can be any piece of information. It can be a press release. It could be any number of things that you're using to build out the foundation for your personalized engine, if you will. And then you turn it into mathematical or numeric values, basically. And that way you can number crunch and do comparisons and do like nearest neighbor and k-means, distant differences, basically. And that's how these things run. And they're just doing all these calculations, these just tremendous amounts of calculations. But you think just in terms of random use cases, I sit there and think to myself, MRIs, the MRI, the actual file of someone's MRI is a massive file. It's huge. I mean, it barely fits onto a CD-ROM. But if you vectorize it, you probably collapse it by 99% in terms of size. And now you can also analyze it more effectively. So this can solve all kinds of problems. All the data storage issues that we have, we can now vectorize this stuff and then put those big fat files in just ice cold storage that's very, very cheap.
It depends what kind of industry you're in, though. I mean, we're getting involved in a lot of healthcare stuff and synthetic data. So actually, creating synthetic data sets, which have got the characteristics of the actual data. That's where you've got to go down that route as well. That's another dimension that people need to think about. It's not just about privacy. Right. It's actually about synthetic data as well. Is an important, principle you've got to work out as well in certain industries, because there's obviously a patient record. There's a lot of, biometric data, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to work out how to manage that data at scale as well. So that's another thing that, it's a lifelong kind of thing to sort out. But I think, generative AI is giving the industry a leg up. It's a 10-headed hydra. How do you manage that in a smart way?
Yeah.
And, a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of risk. So it's back to basics. It's back to basics, but it's also back to, getting executive sponsorship on this kind of stuff and actually getting the right people around the table. And then get, trial and error. Sometimes in enterprises that we see today is they're still a bit scared of failing. But, you've got to do sprints. You've got to apply agile principles. You've got to get to the point where you can you're going to learn something out of the back of doing something quickly, and then you're going to iterate on that. And I know it sounds like an obvious way of approaching it, but we still see some foot factor on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, folks, look these guys up online. Praxi Data, Andrew Turner. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.